Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for spending part of your Valentine's Day with us this afternoon to continue the conversation that General Keith Alexander, the director of the National Security Agency, kicked off with his keynote address over lunch. My name's Michael Desch. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also co-director, along with my colleagues Dan Lindley and Sebastian Rosado, of the Notre Dame International Security Program. The topic we're talking about today almost needs no introduction. You can't open the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, without seeing another revelation from first WikiLeaks and now the Snowden leaks. And this has been followed up by a larger political debate, some of it serious, some of it like the lawsuit that the junior senator from Kentucky has just filed, maybe a little bit less so. This afternoon's conversation, we hope, will add depth and breadth to a discussion of security and privacy in a world of changed threats and new technologies. And we're fortunate to have a truly eminent group of experts who will help us think more deeply and clearly about how to strike the right balance between security and privacy. We thought that we might facilitate such a deeper discussion if we were to organize it around two general panels and a series of questions on each panel. Panel number one will address four questions. First of all, what are the larger philosophic issues that should inform the debate? Secondly, how have changes in technology complicated the old balance? Thirdly, what do policymakers want from the intelligence community? And finally, how can we enhance both security and privacy? And then we'll follow up with a second panel that will look at three specific questions. First of all, what is the appropriate role of the media in this larger debate? Secondly, what is the role of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, one of the key legal bodies that's involved with these larger issues? And then finally, how much does our current legal and regulatory framework really need to change? Now, these panels and issues by no means exhaust the full range of things that we'd want to address to be fully cognizant of these larger issues. But our hope is that there'll be a good starting point for a better and more productive discussion of how we can balance security and privacy and maintain our civil liberties and our national security at the same time. Now, before I introduce two of my distinguished colleagues from the University of Notre Dame, who themselves are experts in key facets of the issue on the table today, I want to again acknowledge the generous support of the Kelly Weiss International Security Speakers Fund, which in fact made these two panels possible today. Notre Dame is blessed with a terrific group of alums and benefactors who make possible a lot of the things that the university does. And Jack Kelly and his wife Gail Weiss are particularly committed to national security studies, and we're deeply grateful for their support. So let me introduce my two colleagues in the two panel chairs right up front, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. Chairing the first panel will be my colleague, Professor Don Howard of Notre Dame's Philosophy Department and the director of our John J. Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values. The Riley Center, under Don's leadership, is doing great work on many topics, including most recently the ethics of military operations. Now, Don, as befitting a philosopher, is a Renaissance man working on many issues in the general area of the philosophy of science, including, apropos of our topic today, virtue and cybersecurity. Chairing our second panel will be my colleague, Patricia Belia of Notre Dame's Law School. Tricia is an expert, among other things, in cyber law and electronic surveillance, but she's not just a theorist, she's also a practitioner with a lot of experience, not only as a clerk to various judges, but also as an attorney advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel of the United States Department of Justice. Don and Tricia, in turn, will introduce our distinguished guests at the beginning of each of their panels. So at this point, let me turn it over to Don.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And let me take the opportunity right here at the beginning of this first panel to say a sincere thank you to you, Mike, for all of your hard work in organizing today's events. There are no more compelling questions out there in the public arena today, and those of us at Notre Dame who care about these topics are pleased and proud to be able to make what we hope is an important contribution to this very significant discussion. I want to keep introductions brief so that we can have as much time as possible for commentary and discussion. I want to begin with a technical point about the order and content of the first panel. The travel gods have not played nicely with us over the past couple of days. Therefore, one of our panelists, Gus Hunt, is going to be participating virtually by a telephone hookup from the snow-covered East Coast. And secondly, in order to accommodate a tight travel schedule, we have moved Bobby Chesney's presentation to the first panel rather than the second, as was originally planned. With that, let's turn right to the matter at hand, and let me begin by introducing our first speaker, who is Tom Sorrell, Professor of Politics and Philosophy and head of the Interdisciplinary Ethics Research Group in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick in the UK. He is a Research Council's UK Global Uncertainties Leadership Fellow, and he conducts research on both terrorism and transnational organized crime. And not only will he bring a certain healthy dose of philosophical abstraction to our discussion, but Tom is also going to bring a bit of a comparative European-U.S. perspective to the discussion. So with that, Tom, please.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to stand up there or speak from here, or does it matter?
I think it might move more smoothly if we just stay here, as long as we can be heard well enough.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Well, first I'd like to thank Don and Mike for inviting me. I'm not going to go very abstract. I am a philosopher, but I think this doesn't require huge amounts of abstraction. I'm going to talk about a couple of things, and I hope I'll have time to go through it. The first thing I'm going to talk about is whether there is some paradox in the very idea of preventive justice. There are quite a few British academic lawyers, I have to say, who think there is a paradox. And that is one of the large issues that hover around the area that we're talking about. And I'll explain that as I go on. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about data mining, which is what a lot of what the NSA business and other similar programs are to do with. Then I'm going to talk about the distinction between domestic and foreign, and friend and enemy, and that kind of thing. Domestic and foreign doesn't map nicely onto any of those, but it's important to the legislation that governs the NSA and what General Alexander was talking about. And if I get there, I will just talk about secrecy and keeping secrets, but I'm going to be really brief about everything. So the first thing, there are a number of very eminent legal theorists, primarily European, who think that crime is what you prosecute and that you don't try to prevent it. That I mean, it's not part of justice to prevent crime, it's part of justice to punish crime. And so when one's talking about preventive policing, or even more than that, criminalizing certain kinds of crime that are preparatory to really harmful crime, like terrorism, there are many people who feel scruples about that. You may not be familiar with counterterrorism legislation in the UK, but to say the least, it is very exacting legislation. There are many penalties for non-disclosure of information, for example, and I'm talking about vast amounts of information that it might be illegal not to disclose. It covers anything that might be useful to terrorism, which really is a very, very inclusive range of things. Do you see what I mean? People think that this tendency in law to start criminalizing attempts, to start criminalizing preparatory actions when people are unable to prosecute terrorism full stop, some people, legal academics, think this is, a violation of liberal justice principles. Now, I don't think that. I think the line of thought that says that it's no part of justice to prevent serious harm is simply incorrect. I think it's incorrect just in describing law, but I think I would put forward the very simple but general principle that the more serious a crime is, the better reason there is, or the more justification there is for preventing it. The more serious a crime is, the more justified it is to prevent it. Now, this might look like pure common sense to you, as it does to me, but there is a vast, and very elite set of lawyers who think this isn't the case. So I want to say that in keeping with that principle, that the more serious a crime is, the more justified we are in preventing it, we could attach to that, the more serious a crime is, the worst sorts of crimes might involve very serious kinds of prevention, and those preventions might include criminalization up to a point. They might include detention, they might include surveillance, and full-out surveillance, not the kind of surveillance that is disputed between General Alexander and other folks, where only data about data is being talked about. So I'm going to come to an example of that from Europe, an example of some preventive measures that have proved controversial and that are different from the NSA but related to the NSA. I'll come to that in a minute. But I'm going to be assuming that the general framework I'm talking about is terrorism and counterterrorism, as I think General Alexander was. I'm not going to be worried about cybercrime in the sense of industrial espionage or even international espionage to steal national commercial secrets. I'm only going to be interested in terrorism. And it's worth just reminding ourselves, as philosophers tend to do, about why terrorism counts as a serious crime, or as the kind of thing that might justify preventive measures, even quite severe preventive measures. It's not just that it often involves mass killing, though that is an extremely important part of the justification for preventive measures. It's also that a lot of that mass killing is indiscriminate, that it often serves the purposes of terrorists to kill the more people, the better, and that many of the people who are killed by terrorism are harmless. They're not armed people, they're just ordinary citizens who are harmless. Aside from that, I'm still talking about why terrorism is really bad. There's the mass fear that can be created, and together with that, the chilling effect of mass fear. This is quite apart from state reactions to mass fear and state reactions to terrorism. There's a chilling effect just from the mass fear that's created by terrorism. And finally, and not at all unimportant, there's the bypassing of terrorists, by terrorists, of democratic institutions. The difficult job of doing politics is kind of bypassed and short-circuited by terrorists. That is bad enough, but then there is often a shameless exploitation of liberal protections from the institutions for which contempt is so often shown. I hope that gives you a kind of range of reasons why terrorism is really multifaceted bad stuff. It isn't just killing. It isn't just 3,000 people dead after 9/11. So if we're looking at terrorism as a specimen of the worst kinds of crime, then we can, I think, start to have some reason why various kinds of preventive measures, including surveillance, can be justified. And I mean, among these measures, the simple criminalization of some preparatory offenses, not all, various kinds of disruptive measures, not all of which involve detention, targeted surveillance, and many other things can in principle be justified. Now let me give you an example from Germany of something controversial that happened in the way of a preventive measure. So after 9/11 in Germany, you remember that the leader of the 9/11 attacks was called Mohammed Atta, and he spent quite a lot of time in Germany, ostensibly as a student. And after the 9/11 attacks, the Germans wanted to find out whether there were terrorist sleepers in Germany. And what they decided to do was to arrive at a profile that terrorist sleepers might fit. And this profile was very crude. They were looking for Muslim men who were in universities, who probably came from North Africa, who paid their utility bills in cash, and who rented accommodation. They ran this profile through a number of data sets, and they came up with thousands and thousands and thousands of possible suspects. Well, the long story, the short story of what happened is that there were no viable prosecutions brought at all, and somebody decided to complain about this policy, this profiling policy, which was called Rasterfahndung, and it came to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court in Germany said that this was illegal. It was disproportionate to have this profiling exercise with its detention program, because, they said, there was no imminent threat. And because there was no imminent threat, it wasn't proportionate to arrest a whole bunch of people on the basis of this. Now, my view is that imminence is not the main issue here. It could be justified for there to be a profiling exercise even if an attack was not imminent, clearly. I mean, it's for the purpose of getting advance warning of lots of different kinds of attack that one might run a profiling exercise of this kind. The main difficulty with this exercise was that it was so crude, that it wasn't really evidence-based, that the people they were looking for were not necessarily appropriate terrorists. Do you see what I mean? So it may be the case that it was discriminatory, but it wasn't disproportionate on the grounds of, I think, a privacy violation, which is what the German Constitutional Court held, since profiling is not necessarily intrusive. A profile is reached and you either satisfy it or don't satisfy it without any intrusion necessarily. So if we start from this Rasterfahndung, one can see that the problem with it is not that it's privacy violating, but that it might be discriminatory and it's not evidence-based. If we draw back from that and ask about the NSA and those kinds of programs, we find, if we believe General Alexander, that there's quite a lot of evidence that might go into the number connections with which are interesting. That evidence has to be found of why a particular number is Al-Qaeda related or what have you, and it's on the basis of that evidence that connections with that number might be regarded as having intelligence interest. So the complaint that I'm making about the Rasterfahndung program can't be made straightforwardly against the NSA program. You see what I mean? Because it's more evidence-based. What may be difficult about the NSA program is that it has such a vast number of search terms. The number of numbers that are interesting to plotting networks and to doing data mining might be very, very large indeed. So I think it's the big data question that was asked of General Alexander. That might be of more relevance to why this might not be such a good program than privacy issues. But there are moral issues, and those moral issues are to do with dragnetting, data mining being evidence-based. Evidence-based data mining, that's the crucial kind of requirement that we can make of all of these dragnetting data mining operations. We could take the example very recently of the British suicide bomber in the last few days. Someone who's originally from Britain participated in the suicide bombing of a prison in Syria. And his addresses are being searched systematically. His telephone records are fair game. And why? Because we have intelligence, specific intelligence, about this guy having links with people who've been convicted of terrorist conspiracies in the UK and who probably radicalized him and sent him on his way. That telephone analysis network of his telephone communications seems to me to be entirely fair game, but that's evidence-based. Do you see what I mean? So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the way that this thing has been framed is maybe slightly inadequate. It's not necessarily that data mining has this privacy-violating side, and this isn't just because it's data about data in the NSA case. It may be because what's wrong with data mining is to do with discriminatoriness, not being evidence-based enough, rather than privacy. You with me? That's what I'm claiming. Now, I have very brief things to say about two other matters. The first is Angela Merkel's telephone. You know Angela Merkel, she's Chancellor of Germany. You heard General Alexander say that they're allies. They were in Afghanistan together, Germany and the United States. And then there's Angela Merkel. You may not know this, but she uses her mobile phone a lot. It's a kind of joke in Germany how much she uses her mobile phone. But the question of whether it's right to be taking data from Angela Merkel's mobile phone, I think that kind of issue is one of the issues that arises from who's foreign and who's domestic. But what I'm trying to say is that in a world that's globalized, where lots of countries, even superpowers, need allies, domestic distinction is not a good distinction. You need the distinction between, at best, between friends and enemies, which is broader than domestic and foreign. By the legislation that Alexander was talking about. So there's a whole range of issues about what counts as a friend and what counts as an enemy, what counts as an ally, and what you do to them in terms of intrusion. That's the one issue that I wanted to talk about. And then again, briefly and finally, I just wanted to talk about how some of the problems with the NSA are inevitable if you think about it, because security involves the division of labor. We delegate security to institutions, do we not? And when we're delegating responsibility to institutions, we know that we can't be consulted about every single thing that's connected with security. So whether we like it or not, we delegate and give discretion to these institutions that we set up to divide the labor of protecting ourselves. And that is one of the difficulties that people land themselves with when they divide labor over security. Now, that's not to say that no oversight should take place, but what I do want to suggest is that the problem that we have here is one of institutional design. It isn't a philosophical, deep moral problem. It's the question of what's the right mechanism to secure oversight over these institutions that we delegate security to? How do we design these things? How often do they report? And what are the dangers of having these oversight? Let me just name one danger. The danger that I feel who is involved in counterterrorism on the outside is starstruckness. When you see some guy who's at the very heart of national defense, like General Alexander, who's so charming, you say, you are starstruck a bit. I mean, I am. I speak to these counter-terrorist guys all the time, and these guys, you get to like them. You go native. Do you see what I mean? And that's what worries me. What worries me is that I spend a lot of time with counter-terrorism guys. Lots of people don't. And I'm more sympathetic to them than I would be if I were slightly at one remove. And we've got to figure out a mechanism that keeps us at one remove. And I just end with a little suggestion on that score. It's a very humble institution that we have in the UK, which is called the Special Assessor for Terrorism Legislation. That's a single lawyer called David Anderson. He's security cleared right to the very top. And he writes reports and makes very serious representations to both government and the security services, but is trusted by all of these guys, and he's in nobody's pocket. And when people say, how do you do it? And how do you do it one day a week? Well, you can look up David Anderson. He's a practicing QC in London. That's it. Thank you.
We're going to turn next to Bobby Chesney, who is the director of the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas, also the Charles Francis Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the School of Law at the University of Texas. Professor Chesney is an expert on legal aspects of U.S. national security policy and practices, including law relating to intelligence collection, covert action, and military operations. And if I might inject just a tiniest little editorial note, you don't know how pleased we at Notre Dame are that the University of Texas had the good sense to hire as its new football coach a former Notre Dame assistant coach. Anyway, with that, Bobby Chesney.
Thank you very much, and we're all pretty excited about Coach Strong. He's going to be good. So my comments will, in many ways, pick up coincidentally, but I think very smoothly from Tom's final point in talking about the mechanics of oversight. But I'm going to get there in a roundabout way, so if you'll bear with me. Against the backdrop of declining trust in government and growing suspicion about the activities of the intelligence community, there was a stunning leak to the media, a leak that depicted mass domestic surveillance, and it set off a firestorm of controversy. There were outraged editorials, there was a blue ribbon presidential investigative commission, and of course Congress began holding hearings. And it was very clear to everyone involved that what we were looking at was a sea change in the whole intelligence community enterprise. Or at least that's the way it looked to William Colby when he was just finished being the director of the CIA in the mid-1970s and writing his memoir about his time there, describing 1974 as this dramatic year where one Seymour Hersh article just brought it all into the spotlight, and it all seemed to spill forth from then. And it was never quite the same. And of course, the events of the mid-70s engulfed not just the CIA, but also the FBI, the Army, and the NSA, and just about every institution involved in the national security establishment. It was a cycle, and it ran its course over the course of several years in the 70s, and it left its imprint or its footprints in American law, in American policy structures, and especially what became eventually Executive Order 12333, the Attorney General guidelines, and so forth. And it left its imprint especially on the institutional cultures of these entities. Now, over time, the question shifted from how do we prevent abuse in these entities in light of the abuses that were unveiled, and focusing instead on whether the pendulum had swung too far. How, in an increasingly dangerous world, do we make sure these entities are actually doing the jobs for which they were created? The pendulum began swinging back the other way. The cycle continued. And over the following decades, in the 80s and the 90s and into the post-9/11 period, the oscillation continued, and it continued no small amount. But one thing that's noticeable about this dynamic over the past decade, over the past 10 years in particular, or maybe I should say really the past 7 years, going back to the New York Times revelations of warrantless surveillance, it's the increasing centrality of NSA to this cycle of concern about how we limit either too much or too little the intelligence community. The NSA has moved to center stage in a way that's different, certainly from the 1970s cycle, though it was part of the story then. This shouldn't surprise us. Communications technology, the foundation for SIGINT, it's more central to our lives than ever before, and it's increasingly becoming so. And technological change ensures this is going to continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. Now, for all the opportunities for SIGINT collection that this technological trend generates, there are obviously dangers as well. It used to be said rather breezily and in a rather uninformed way, I think. It used to be said frequently that the younger generations don't care about privacy. We've all heard this claim. They put everything on Facebook. They don't care about their privacy. But of course, this was always nonsense. It was true that there was sharing of things via technology that were different than what older generations were comfortable with. But it was never on a, I don't care who might see this basis. It's been proven recently that these types of thoughts, that coming generations don't care about privacy, I think we've seen over the past 6 months, that's not the case. In fact, concern for privacy is as alive and well in the United States probably as it has ever been. Privacy concerns are robust in our society, and they cut diagonally across the political spectrum in a way that confounds relatively familiar, widely accepted notions of how you're supposed to feel depending on which party you're in on issues of liberty versus security. But as robust as privacy concerns have proven to be over the past 6 months, it would be a mistake to think that it's just one thing, that there's one privacy concern. It's actually far more complex than that, of course. At the risk of still oversimplifying it, I want to emphasize a particular distinction, a divide that runs right down the middle. Well, perhaps that's not proportional. I'll leave it to you to judge. But a divide that separates the category of privacy concern in a fundamental way. There are those who prize privacy out of fear of what information, personal information in the hands of the government, what might be done with it. This is the risk of abuse fear. This strain of privacy is about risk of abuse. At some level, I think everyone shares this view. We just differ in the extent to which we trust the existing institutions and individuals involved in administering this information, and perhaps also, or certainly also, in the extent to which we're willing to tolerate some particular error rate. There's always going to be an error rate. It's a human system. There will always be errors. Some amount of abuse will occur on the margins. If you follow these stories, you'll know that there will be some love-int. Does that phrase, do people know what that's referring to? I can explain later if we wish. There'll be an error rate, and some people will want to minimize it more than others. But the important point is that this species of privacy concern, in theory, can be addressed consistent with preserving some of the intelligence collection, analysis, and dissemination capacities that we've been talking about over the past 6 months. You can, if you don't think the current internal controls are good enough, there are ways to address them. And in theory, you can capture a greater and greater slice of those whose primary motivation is fear of abuse. So from that perspective, and if that were the only perspective, then we'd mainly be talking about internal controls combined with public affairs. And by that I mean you need to have some ability not just to have good internal controls, but to convince people that that is in fact the case. Now, as recent events underscore, getting that problem addressed obviously isn't easy. It seems pretty clear that we have not gotten to that place, even for those whose concerns are limited to risk of abuse. That brings us to the second type of concern. It's not just about risk of abuse, obviously. For some people, even if you stipulated that you have great internal controls that will minimize as much as humanly possible the risk of abuse, it's the principle of the thing. It's the fact that the information is known to the government. And why does that matter? I think the usual account is that this decreases the space for ideological diversity and pluralism in a democratic society, chills expression and dissent, legitimate dissent, in ways that are over the long term especially not desirable. Now, certainly this perspective has its virtues. Of course, embracing that perspective whole hog comes with cost, right? If, to the extent you preserve these spaces, you're inevitably also creating space for bad actors. However we decide to define them, there will be some place in which truly dangerous activities may be taking place, but for some, that's an acceptable trade-off, or at least some version of that. The critical point is, now that we've entered our own 1974, or for some people who went through the 1974 experience, another 1974, the task is to find the road back to a suitable equilibrium, and it looks quite different what that path might be, whether you're focused on addressing the first type of privacy concern I mentioned, the fear of abuse kind, or instead you're focused on addressing the second kind, the absolute zone for diversity of thought, if you will. I believe that much of the public debate and the angst is largely driven by fear of the first variety. I certainly agree that the second variety is there. Some of the most passionate participants in the debate are very committed to the second variety. But I think for the public reaction, the big bulk of it is primarily in the anti-abuse variety. And at any rate, that's certainly the place to concentrate efforts insofar as what we're trying to do is to restore a new equilibrium that will have a good balance between the ability to exploit some of these technologies and preserving our commitment to privacy. This is the more ripe area for making progress and reaching agreement. So what might you do? We all know there have been an array of recommendations from advisory groups. They have proliferated like Topsy, and we know too that the president himself has responded with a mix of agreement on some points and further suggestions on others. And depending on the details of that, some of this may be more helpful than others. I don't want to dwell on, and I think the later panel may dwell more on the particulars of these changes to the legal and policy rule sets that govern SIGINT collection. I want to suggest to you in my closing moments here that it's a mistake to focus entirely on the legal and policy rule sets. There's another kind of rule set that's out there, code. Code is law of a certain kind. Now, I want to pause here. I can't resist, when I was thinking through what I'm trying to say here, how technology is the answer to a problem that has its roots in technology, I can't help but think of the great philosopher Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, in one of my favorite moments in all of the Simpsons series, stands atop a stack of beer barrels with a mug of beer in his hand, and he shouts, "To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems." That's kind of my point here. Technology is the cause of the problem that's upset our equilibrium, such as it is. But I want to suggest to you that technology is a major part of the solution. And what I'm getting at there is the notion, and we heard a little bit of this in General Alexander's talk earlier, devices like immutable audit trails, data logs that cannot be scrubbed, interfered with, or at least not by anyone who's in a position to actually use the underlying technologies. Connecting the fruits of these types of technologies to outside observers, whether it's the Inspector General's office within the NSA, or the one within DOJ, or the one at the ODNI, or connecting it to the oversight bodies on the Hill, bringing to bear, and this is where I think it connects to Tom's point, bringing to bear multiple outside oversight bodies so you minimize the risk of capture, you create a somewhat of a competitive environment amongst them, but you hardwire through technology the means both to make it hard to abuse the system on the front end, to make sure that the rules of the road that are democratically agreed to are in fact the ones that are then followed. Or as the Chief Compliance Officer at NSA, John DeLong, as he would put it, that the recipe is followed by the chefs, so that if there are any problems, you can complain about the people that wrote the recipe, but you can't complain about the chef. I think technology provides a substantial part of the answer. And I think that in our discussions over the past month and a half in the national dialogue, we've been a little bit too focused on changing what's written down on paper, tweaking this and that, and not focused enough on talking about how the technology can provide assurance to at least one major slice of the community of interest that's upset about what's been happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bobby. We're now going to move into Gus Hunt's presentation, and I remind you, Gus is not here in the room with us. He's participating by telephone from his snowbound home. Let me briefly introduce Gus. Had a very long and distinguished career, 28 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, during which time, among many responsibilities, he served as the CIA's Chief Technology Officer. Gus is now the President and CEO of Hunt Technology, a consulting company that focuses on strategic IT planning, IT effectiveness and efficiency, cyber security, data-centric protection, and the cloud. Not surprisingly, given that pedigree, what Gus has been asked to talk about, in part at least, is the technical perspective on the issues that confront us today. Gus, are you with us?
I am, Don. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right, excellent, thanks. Well, I want to thank you first, Mike, Don, for speaking today. I'm hoping we have a good section all the way through this. And I want to thank Bobby for setting me up at the close of this comment, because I think if anybody is absolutely correct, technology is both the bane of our existence and the answer to our crisis problems as we look on ahead here. So at the risk of sounding trite, I'll tell you that technology is the ultimate double-edged sword. I think that was Bobby's point that was right there. In today's age and where we are now, it equally enables both us and our adversaries. It creates opportunities and challenges and solutions. It's created this, what I find to be, if you think about it, a very scary world of what I call frictionless cyber warfare. In the old days of warfare, the time between the discovery of a new capability or the fielding of a new weapon system, there was latency involved from that event until your opponents and your enemies could field an equivalent capability. Today, that time has been very nearly reduced to zero. If you look at Stuxnet as an example, once it was discovered in the wild, it was just a matter of days before it was completely decoded, published in Der Spiegel, and then variants emerged to attack back SCADA systems back from the wild. Technology is the cause, I think, of the discussion we're having today. It's going to bring solutions to issues that may seem insurmountable today, and I'll tell you, it's going to create new issues for tomorrow, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. So, if we can just take a step back and let's think about what's happened just basically in the last maybe 10 years or less. When I took over as CTO in 2009, the world of cloud was kind of just getting off the ground and getting started and getting serious as we were emerging from the 2007-2008 financial collapse. And what's happened in the world that we're in today is it's driven by this thing called SMAC, SMAC, which is Social Mobile Analytics and Cloud. And this has brought technological changes and driven fundamental changes in society and things like that at a faster pace, I think, than government or law can keep up. And it has fundamentally altered the concept of privacy and control. So today, if you ever take a walk outside, your assumption should be that you're always on camera. And I'm just not talking about the cameras that cities put in place for security monitoring and things like that, but the fact that everybody has at least one of them on them if they carry a cell phone. And while there is no expectation of privacy in a public space, now your public transgressions, if we use Valentine's Day here as a good example, when you want to steal a kiss from your secret beloved, are recorded and perhaps permanently available to anyone forever on YouTube. Right? Social discourse has moved into inadequate, sensitive, not very private social media sites and has fundamentally changed the flow of communications and information. When I came into the agency in 1985, the one-to-many world of BBC and TASS and the New York Times and NBC News and things like that, where the big behemoth communication providers and information providers would tell you what was happening in the world, has shifted into this world of the many-to-many communication mediums of Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat. And as a result of this, the data volume has grown absolutely explosively across the board, but the volume of information that's contained in that is unchanged or minorly changed, if you ask me. Signal to noise has simply gotten much worse, and the ability for intelligence communities, law enforcement, or governments to figure out what's actually going on in the world is a much more difficult challenge than it's ever been before. Right? On the other hand, the technology has done things like make it exceptionally difficult for totalitarian regimes to shut down communications in their entirety. Just witness Arab Spring and the efforts that some of the governments made in order to stop people from being able to talk to each other, and it was to almost no effect. They were able to continue to communicate through various devices and capabilities enabled by technology to prosecute their objectives and their goals. I think Bobby was the one that mentioned that we think our children have a fundamentally different view of privacy, and I don't subscribe to this point of view. I think their seemingly casual view of privacy is a temporary thing, and fundamentally as they live the consequences of such behavior. Much like we teach our children not to touch a hot stove, in many ways, a slightly burnt finger or hand on the hot stove is a much better teacher than all the verbal admonitions combined. But just like the hot stove, we have to ensure that the injury is not dramatic or fatal in terms of what happens as our children learn to operate and behave in this world, in this new interconnected world that was brought to us by ubiquitous mobility and the cloud as it exists. Right? In this world, unfortunately, the internet is the elephant that never forgets, and it's already begun to alter society in unexpected ways with unexpected consequences. For example, the ability for reinvention for people who had transgressions early in life and to go someplace else and reinvent themselves and become good citizens and move on. The internet has made it far too easy for people to discover their existence and fight them with this for a long time to come. Reinvention used to be a critical part of our society and the ability for us as human beings to make mistakes when we were younger and grow up and then learn to become good citizens. Michael Phelps's Bond pictures that were all over the internet will plague him probably for the rest of his life, as an example. And then, of course, you have this cloud analytics and big data thing, which has enabled massive amounts of computational power to run together using sophisticated algorithms on this enormous amount of data that has emerged, so that we can discover minute personal patterns and behaviors that were previously just too difficult for us to find. Now, if you just take that and think about where we're heading into the future, this new thing called the Internet of Things is only going to exacerbate this situation enormously. Everything is going to communicate, not just people, but all devices, all sensors, all phones, your refrigerator, everything else together, all going to talk to each other, and this is going to have a massive explosion of the volume of data. Sensors are going to be everywhere and everything, and what we thought was a big data problem of the current period is going to increase data volume by somewhere in the neighborhood, I think, of 3 to 5 or more orders of magnitude over the next 5 to 7 years. And what's interesting is that the traditional modes of intelligence collection that grew up in the paper age, which is a lot of the law that I think Bobby was referring to from 1974, are not sufficient in this world. As I mentioned before, data volumes are massive, signal noise is now getting worse, the global nature of communications makes it difficult to sort out a U.S. person from a non-U.S. person. I'll give you an interesting example. I consult with a Canadian company with a Canadian citizen as the CEO, and he has a U.S.-based cell phone. I also consult with a company with a U.S. citizen living in Canada who has a Canadian cell phone. Which one is which, and how do you begin to sort this out as we look at the issues that we face as we go forward into this world, trying to figure out what our law allows us to do or does not allow us to do. And then you have our adversaries who learn very quickly how to hide the gaps of our law and hide the gaps of our organizational structures that were built up in a period in the paper age when information volumes and the ability to use technology to hide yourself were probably much more tractable problems to deal with. Right? So targets shift and move. The ephemeral nature of communications make targeted collection much more difficult. And those that intend to do us harm, of course, are not constrained by the very laws that protect us from the excesses that we worry about that will prevent us from sliding down the hill towards the totalitarian regimes that we fear. All right? So today, you personally are a walking sensor platform. Today, your cars are rolling sensor platform. The system is already taking advantage of information to improve traffic flow, identify living mechanical problems, when they become catastrophic. They're also used to inform police and insurance companies exact conditions that precede an accident, etc. The black box, the plane is now inside of every vehicle, and it makes for a much better way in some worlds and a much more difficult world in other ways. Right? Tomorrow, your refrigerator, your toaster, your pacemaker, your insulin pump will all communicate with each other, both for good and for frustration, and to open doors for both the well-intentioned and will open doors for the malicious as well. If you ask me, either the future that I always worry about, which is it's early Monday morning, you're really tired and you're exhausted. You go up to your local Dunkin' Donuts and you get yourself one of their great big, sausage sandwiches on a croissant, one of those great big fattening donuts they have, a triple latte, and go to pay for it, and you slide your credit card in the thing, and the system comes back and says, I'm sorry, Gus, you're not allowed to buy this, your blood pressure is too high, you're overweight, and you're pre-diabetic. So we're not going to sell it to you. And this is the type of thing that all this interconnection is, of course, going to enable the state to make happen and make it happen. The vulnerabilities are going to grow and get harder to fix as we move into this world of billions and billions of smartphones and smart devices. And so the fact that our adversaries can take advantage of the 5 or 6 billion cell phones and the vulnerabilities that are emerging into this space to both attack us and steal our money and do malicious harm. Imagine a world of tens of billions to hundreds of billions of smart devices distributed everywhere on the planet, to which they will be much harder to patch, much harder to fix, and much slower to correct, creating a vulnerability, points of vulnerability into the system that we do not control and have no knowledge of. Intelligence in the system is also going to grow too. The smarts are going to be distributed to the edge and must be distributed to the edge, because it will be impossible to bring all the data back to the center for processing. And this thing we know as the cloud will extend seamlessly from the center of the world that we talk about when we think of Amazon, or Azure, or anybody else as the cloud, all the way to your single device of one and back again. And for those of you who don't think that this is reality, this has already begun, simply because if you use anything like iCloud or Amazon's cloud storage system or Azure to store your personal stuff off of your phone, you've already entered into that world without realizing it. So what's really interesting is that emerging through this technological haze then are the solutions that will put protection and control back in the hands of individuals, companies, and organizations. Encryption is moving into silicon and will enable everything to be encrypted everywhere all the time. Although I will tell you that, as I think the intelligence community knows, the secret sauce to encryption is actually key management, and that becomes probably the most difficult problem to solve. But I believe it will get solved across the board. Then there are applications that are emerging that will leverage this encryption to ensure that you will be able to control the disposition of your information, your emails, your intellectual property, even after they have left the boundaries of your control. So that when you send me something that you say that I can't forward this, I can't move it, I can't copy it, I can't print it, those are enforced independent of what I want to do with the information. Networks are going to become dynamic and temporary. They're going to be constantly changing for your protection. Fundamentally, if your network is always moving and constantly changing, you can't attack what you can't find. And then compute and data will be in constant motion and distributed across the cloud. Physical locality will become temporary and meaningless in this world. Now, what's interesting is that these solutions are going to pose great challenges to governments, law enforcement, and intelligence. As they can be used, because they can and will be used by those intent on committing harm, equally as well as they protect the interests and equities of law-abiding citizens, companies, and of course, enabling national security. I believe they are absolutely essential to a strong and free society, a powerful and growing economy, and also to our national security across the board. It is my personal view that legislating technology, i.e. mandating weak standards or backdoors, for example, actually has the inverse effect of what is desired. The bad guys pay no attention to law-abiding, to the law, and law-abiding citizens and companies are forced to use weak or compromised capabilities are placed at enormous risk of predation by those bad actors. I believe that such laws actually weaken our national security. I think that they have a further detrimental effect of creating foreign competition, specifically designed to serve those who wish to avoid such limitations, and worse than they also wind up restricting innovation in the U.S., the very engine that drives our economy. Ultimately, that becomes a quadruple whammy, adversely affecting privacy, the economy, innovation, and national security. Anyhow, those are my thoughts about where technology is going and what's ultimately on the plate, and hopefully, if there's time for questions at the end, I'll be delighted to take them.
Well, thank you very, very much, Gus. It was very, very interesting. We now turn to our last panelist, whose presence makes the point that the great state of Texas is extraordinarily well represented here today. William M. Bowden is Bobby Chesney's colleague in the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. He is also the executive director of the William P. Clements Jr. Center for History, Strategy, and Statecraft at the University of Texas, Austin. And he also serves as an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. William M. Bowden, please.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Howard, and thank you, Professor Desch, for having us here. I couldn't help but smile when I heard Professor Sorrell mention in his closing comment the risk of scholars becoming starstruck in the presence of counterterrorism and leading intelligence officials. So for us professors, it's always a risk of being starstruck in Mike Desch's presence as a longtime colleague of his. So anyway, Mike, thank you for having us here.
I do that 20 bucks.
All right, that's right. So anyway, and as someone who's trying to wean himself from a Dunkin' Donuts habit, I just hope that my wife doesn't learn about that new technology Mr. Hunt mentioned, that Dunkin' Donuts can assess your cholesterol levels and everything and keep you away. So. In addition to my scholarly roles, I previously spent about a decade in different national security policy positions in Washington, D.C., including at the State Department and the National Security Council, and have also spent a number of years as a consultant to the intelligence community on putting together strategic forecasting assessments about what the future might look like. And so it's from that vantage point that I'm going to share my brief comments today, which is a perspective that I think has often been lost in the last year's tumult over the Snowden revelation. So much of the spotlight right now continues to be, what is the intelligence community doing? And that's, there's some very good questions being raised, but what I think has been lost in that is, why is the intelligence community doing what it's doing? And a lot of the reason why is because of the demands that policymakers are putting on the intelligence community. And as a erstwhile policymaker myself, I, over the years, developed a number of observations about what seemed to me to be some of the more reasonable demands policymakers put on the intelligence community, and then frankly a lot of unreasonable demands that policymakers put on the intelligence community, even impossible demands. I think this is really important context for understanding why General Alexander shared what he did today, why folks at the NSA go to work every day doing what they're doing, why our CIA, human intelligence collectors, and other three-letter agencies do what they do. They certainly have a strong sense of mission, but they also have a strong mandate coming from the policy community. And during my time as a policymaker, and with extensive interaction with the intelligence community, came to realize a couple things, two general observations. One, the intelligence community certainly is imperfect. I had started off in government, coming in initially as an outsider thinking that they really are all-seeing, all-knowing, and finally once I'm in the situation room, all secrets will be revealed, and then you're sitting around the table, you realize, wow, no one here really knows what's going on, just like we didn't on the outside. We have huge gaps in our knowledge. So it demystified the intelligence community a little bit. On the other hand, I also came to see that we policymakers, and I'm use myself in the first person here, place almost impossible demands on the intelligence community, which we as policymakers aren't always accountable for. So I think it's appropriate that at a conference sponsored by the University of Notre Dame, consider this my act of penance, actually, where I want to lay out a number of ways that we policymakers, I think, are responsible for some of these unreasonable demands. So I've come up with 7 impossible demands that policymakers put on the intelligence community. So I'm going to read each of these as kind of an assertion that policymakers are saying to the intelligence community, and this is how it sounds oftentimes to the intelligence community. 1, take any risks and do whatever it takes to get me the intelligence I need, but don't break any laws, offend any allied nations, prompt any congressional investigations, make any mistakes, or let the media find out in the process. And that kind of frames the next 6 ones, which are more specific. But that really is oftentimes the policy perspective, that we demand perfect intelligence on anything we want to know about that has happened, is happening, or will happen, and yet we don't want any messiness to be associated with it, legally, ethically, politically, et cetera. The second one, produce intelligence on what I want to know about, but also tell me about what I don't know about. And this is a more particular one for a lot of analysts, but on the one hand, policymakers have several issues we're concerned about. Whatever, is it terrorism, WMD proliferation, the rise of Russia, the rise of China. And so we're always going to badger the intelligence community to give us more and more on these things we're thinking about. But it's also the job of the intelligence community to surface issues, remind us of things that we may not know about at all. What are the issues that are looming out there that we should be paying attention to but aren't? Now, ideally, those can be reconciled and there's a nice balance, and sometimes there is, but oftentimes in a world of limited bandwidth, limited resources, limited time, limited attention spans, those really are impossible. Third, give me accurate and precise forecasts about the future, but don't make any mistakes. And again, this is where policymakers will give you their frustrations, to use two caricatures, but this isn't too far off. Sometimes we'd get a forecast that would say essentially, over the next year, we judge it about a 50% likelihood that the sun may or may not rise in the east at some point. Well, it's probably going to happen, but it's really not useful to us at all. It's incredibly safe and incredibly vague. On the other hand, every now and then, someone in IC would come up with a very specific, precise forecast. Something like, say, issuing an assessment today, February 14th, 2014, that on March 15th, 2015, a little over a year from now, Vladimir Putin will wake up at 6:30 a.m., eat a poached egg for breakfast, and then conduct another intermediate range ballistic missile test in violation of the INF treaty. Well, that would be really specific, really precise, and really helpful. But I guarantee you that if a year and a month from now, that day rolls around and Putin wakes up at 6:30 and conducts an intermediate range ballistic missile test that violates the treaty, but eats oatmeal instead of a poached egg, that poor analyst is going to hear only about, why did you say it was going to be a poached egg when it ended up being oatmeal? So, in other words, forecasting successes are rarely acknowledged. All the intelligence community successes, they never come to light, but the failures certainly are remembered and highlighted. Fourth, this will give you a little bit of sense of some of the disposition or attitude within the intelligence community, particularly on threat assessments. And again, here's the admonition. Warn me from the policymaker. Warn me about what can go wrong, but encourage me about what can go right. And oftentimes the intelligence community gets the first part, they do better with the first part than the second part. I reminded a colleague and I from the National Security Council went out and spent a day with a lot of the senior collectors at CIA one time to do a brainstorming session with them. We spent most of the time talking about all the ways things could go wrong in the world, all the different threats that they were following, different warnings they were issuing. And then towards the end of the day, we said, well, this has been really helpful. You've given us a lot to chew on, but can you tell us any opportunities you see out there, anything that might surprise us and actually go right in the world, any positive things? And we just got a room full of blank stares. And then we said, okay, well, let's give you some time to think about that. Give us a report on that in a week. And a week later, they sent us a report, and it was really thin. And we realized, well, on the one hand, it was a kind of a rough year, and there weren't many good things happening in the world that year. But on the other hand, this was a very revealing window for us. All of their incentives are only prevent things from going wrong, warn us when something might go wrong. It's a real pessimistic, Murphy's Law type attitude, which they need to have because the costs of something going wrong and missing it, such as 9/11, such as Pearl Harbor, to go back much further, are so catastrophic. But that can create its own self-reinforcing negative mentality. Fifth admonition, don't just produce lowest common denominator consensus assessments, but don't disagree with each other too much either. And again, policymakers get very frustrated when you get these really watered down reports from the intelligence community that are canvassing everyone's assessment, again, that have these real vague generalities. We judge with strong confidence that China is a large nation in East Asia. But other than that, we just can't tell you too much specific about China. Well, that's completely useless, but what they were trying to do there is take all the opinions about China across the intelligence community and boil them down. So that drives policymakers nuts. On the other hand, sometimes we would get reports, again, a report on the future of China that'll have 10 points from 10 different analysts from 10 different three-letter agencies, and all 10 of those points completely contradict each other. And you realize that we just stepped into some sort of family squabble or food fight about China within the intelligence community. We didn't know what to think. So we'd call up and say, look, can't you guys get your act together and come up with some sort of consensus? So again, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. Finally, number 6, the penultimate one. Give me raw intelligence so I can make up my own mind, but also give me polished analytic products so I can understand what the raw intelligence means. Again, this is to get a little more technical, but every senior policymaker in his or her heart of hearts really thinks that they are the best analysts the intelligence community ever had as well. They all want to be their own intelligence officer. And so they're always saying to the intelligence communities, don't just give me these polished summaries that your analysts are writing. I want to read the raw take. I want to read the intercepts. I want to read the human collection. I want to see what so-and-so is really saying to so-and-so, and I'll make up my own mind about what it means. Well, again, that puts tremendous pressure on the intelligence community to be collecting even more and more of this stuff, but it drives them nuts when policymakers take this, read it out of context, and then go make perhaps rash decisions based on distorted intelligence, and then say, oh, I got that from the intelligence community. So on the other hand, there's also a lot of pressure. If the intelligence community just dumps all the raw data on us as policymakers, then we call them up and complain, look, you guys have all those analysts we're paying billions of dollars a year for, write it up and summarize it for us. So again, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. Finally, the 7th impossible demand that I think policymakers put on the intelligence community. Keep us safe and keep us free. That may sound familiar because that's also the demand the American people put on their government. And that's a lot of what this conference is about. But I bring that up because policymakers are very attentive to public opinion. Policymakers, in turn, we put a lot of those same, we kind of transmit a lot of those demands onto the intelligence community as well. And at the end of the day, this is something that I think it's a collective responsibility of all Americans, private citizens, policymakers, and the intelligence community to try to strike that appropriate balance. But consider this, like I said, some brief 7 statements of penitence from a former policymaker for all the abuse I hurled at the intelligence community. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Bill. It looks like we have about 5 minutes for some questions. Let me first invite the members of the panel, if any of you have a question or comment you'd like to put to another panelist, take a moment to do so. No? Well, then in that case, let's turn it to the audience. We invite your questions, please. Yes, right here. And please speak up too, if you could, please.
So you talked some about how technology could help to fix a lot of the problems that we have here and how code can be part of the solution, but you didn't mention personal use of a lot of this code, like individual people using cryptography in their own media. Do you see that becoming a big part of this, and what effect do you think it would have?
Bobby, could you repeat?
Sure. So the question, Monica's question is, as encryption becomes more and more, I'm going to paraphrase it and correct me if I'm wrong, but as encryption becomes ubiquitous in personal run-of-the-mill communications, the emails I send to my friends and so forth, and as we get ever more of this, and I think the general talked about this a little bit in his speech, how does that particular element of technological change impact the larger question of how do we strike a new set of rules of the road for the NSA? Is that a fair?
Sort of, because a lot of,
Thank
There we
you. Really, I was asking more, not just
It's encrypted.
okay. So,
I'll repeat it.
okay. So, there's here we go. So, it is true that encryption is becoming built into a lot of things more, but there's also, say, email encryption that is not standard, and people would have to take initiative on their own to start using that. Do you think, and the NSA is actually working to actively undermine encryption standards and build in backdoors and make crypto that people use weaker. Do you see people starting to use crypto on their own more, and do you see a good way to fight back against the NSA's undermining
I see. So I do think certainly that in no small part because of the attention drawn to the general topic over the past 6 months because of the revelations, we're going to see a more rapid embrace both by ordinary users of encryption technology, and we'll see more entrance into the marketplace to provide that. There's going to be a lot more interest in doing it. There will be people who are now more motivated to allocate capital to those types of ventures, not necessarily because they think in part because they may think, aha, there's more of a market for this now. I mean, we're seeing some of that, right? People are going to at the ISP level and at the software level. There will be entrants to the market who see an opportunity. It's almost like, making sure at your grocery store you sell organic food because you've heard that's become a big deal. There's going to be a market response to interest in privacy, and that will lead to more encryption. This will make it more challenging as this spreads. It will speed the rate at which the NSA encounters new challenges. It's a constant process. This is nothing new. The NSA is constantly grappling with new innovations in encryption. Things will go along quicker, and this is part of what I think the general and others are talking about when they say our jobs have gotten harder because of this. That's a small part of it. The question draws our attention to something that's really interesting about the multiple roles that the NSA, or rather that the head of NSA, that the general occupies both as Cyber Command's commander and as NSA. They're both defensive and, if you will, offensive collection type capacities here. One of the things these people are doing is defending networks in the government and military level from intrusion, which calls for the best possible encryption you can come up with, right? And no small amount of the private technologies are really relevant for that mission as well. So there's a tension built into what their institutional incentives are. And while I'm not suggesting that protect and encrypt incentive outweighs what you described as the undermining incentive, there is actually that tension within the building. And I think it creates almost a personality conflict at certain high policy levels as to what ought to be the posture of the NSA. And on this question of how much should we try to persuade standard-setting entities not to go to some further level that would present challenges. And this draws attention to a larger question of policy, which is that's a true question of strategy in the cybersecurity realm. Who exactly is best positioned to do long-term thinking about what's in the best long-term interest of the United States as a whole on that? Should that decision come from within NSA? Should it happen at Fort Meade? Should it be happening at a higher level of policymaking? And if so, is it happening, and are the right people at the table for it?
There is so much to discuss here, but time is short. I'll allow one more very, very brief question, and then we must take a brief break. Patrick, please. Or back. Two. Okay, two.
This is for Professor Inboden. To what extent is there an actual dialogue between the intelligence community and policymakers about as you were describing, the kind of unreasonable restrictions and assumptions and wants of the policymakers? Is there a back and forth of you're asking for X, Y, and Z, and it's not possible, and this is why this is being unfair? Is there any back and forth at all?
So, no, great question, and yes, there is. There's extensive back and forth. There's almost a constant dialogue, which is good and healthy. And so all these issues I surfaced are very familiar to anyone working on either side of the intel policy community. But that said, these are also persistent issues. They haven't been solved. In some ways, they never really truly will, because these are just two. Each one represents a dichotomy and different emphases. But the one other challenge to all this, maybe if I were even add an eighth one, is for the intelligence community, they're constantly admonished, do policy relevant intelligence, don't be doing intelligence for us on 16th century, romantic literature. Maybe that's policy relevant. I guess this is Valentine's Day. I don't know. But at the same time, don't try to do policy. Just as I mentioned, every senior policymaker in his or her, secret heart thinks he or she is a great intel analyst. Just about every intelligence officer also wants to be a policymaker. And so that's where there still does need to be that firewall where the intelligence people do the intelligence and try to stay, very policy neutral. They're not shading it one way or another, because policymakers are very sensitive to that. This is our prerogative. We set the policy. It's similar to civilian military relations. And so, but the very fact of that divide between who does intel and who does policy, even though there's conversations back and forth, that's always going to create an inherent tension there.
Last question, Patrick.
My father, I'm a journalist. My father always told me when it came to journalists, don't believe half the lies you read. And I think that's critical to what you're talking about omniscience and benevolence, about how we view intelligence agencies, kind of like they're God. And partly it's about ignorance and that the journalists are in between. And what can the professors and intelligence community do to educate the people that are interfacing with policy people and the public?
Were you asking? Oh, anybody. Well, I think that's a really good question. What we try to do in my group is to have interactions between people who don't speak to one another very much. So, for instance, in our group, we have a lot of interactions between technology developers, commercial technology developers in counterterrorism, police and intelligence, and ethicists and human rights lawyers. And those have created, over quite a period of time, very frank discussions, maybe slightly disquieting at times discussions, but I think that's the way you try to do it. You try to get folks not speaking to people whose reactions are very predictable, like break this cozy symbiosis between the policymakers and the intel folks, bring some people in they haven't spoken to, inappropriate circumstances, closed meetings, no journalists, fewer inhibitions.
So, Gus, would you like to weigh in on any of the foregoing, and especially this last question and answer?
Well, I'm not sure I want to weigh on the last one here. I think that there's some truth to the fact that anything which appears to be mysterious or not well communicated generates all sorts of speculation, innuendo, or perhaps even you can attribute godlike things to it. I think more important for me, looking back, was the question on, where this goes in encryption, and I worry, going back to my original statement, that government is going to actually decide they have to weigh in on this, when the reality is that this cat is out of the bag, and it's something that's going to happen and become ubiquitous across the board. It's how we play this and where this goes, I think, is just a function of where it's all driving to, and let's see where it lands.
Very good. Please join me one more time in thanking all of our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sure.
Thank you. Mike, can I introduce you to somebody?
So to my left here is Steve Bradbury, a partner at Deckert. But for our purposes, he's had some very important service at the Department of Justice. He was there from 2005 to 2009, including both as the principal deputy in the Office of Legal Counsel and as the acting head of that office. And during that period of time, he led the effort to obtain court approval for the Section 215 bulk metadata program. So he was at the center of that, and General Alexander pointed that out. So I think we have the perfect legal expert here on that. He also participated in the administration's cooperation with Congress in getting passage of the amendments to FISA. And then on the screen, we have Judge Carr, who wasn't able to join us in person. Judge Carr has been a federal district judge now for 20 years. And before that, he had 15 years of service as a magistrate judge. But what you may not know about him is he's an expert in electronic surveillance law. He has the leading treatise on that subject. And so he's forgotten a lot more about surveillance law than any of us will ever know. Which made him a perfect candidate to be appointed by the Chief Justice to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So he served a 7-year term there from 2002 to 2008, and I know we'll bring a lot of insights from that perspective. And then furthest on the left here is a Lieutenant General Mick Traynor, who spent 39 years in the Marine Corps, and when he retired from the Marine Corps, became the chief military correspondent for the New York Times. Currently is a military analyst for NBC and has co-authored 3 books on U.S. military operations. So he'll bring some great insight for us in terms of the role of the media in the debate here. So I will start first here to my left. Thanks.
Tricia, thanks. Thanks so much. And Mike, thank you. And I thank Notre Dame for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here, and it's great to see General Alexander. Now that we've covered philosophy and highfalutin policy and all of these abstract issues and concepts, perhaps we should have done this at the very beginning, but I'm going to, I think, just try to bring it back down to ground and on a more prosaic level, cover three things. Number one, I'm going to describe the two principal NSA programs that are the source of so much controversy and the subject of such debate in Washington and across the country as a result of the Snowden disclosures. Those are the two that at least have the potential to relate to the communications of Americans. It might touch communications of Americans and require the approval of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISA court that Judge Carr sat on. So just after briefly describing what it is the NSA is doing that has caused so much controversy, I'm then going to cover briefly the legal basis for it. Just explain so people can understand what the legal analysis is that supports the legality of the programs, both the constitutional, that's the Fourth Amendment analysis of each, and the statutory basis for each. And you may disagree with it. There's been a lot of debate and discussion about that, certainly in Washington, and it may prompt questions, but I think it's important to just kind of understand the basics of the legal analysis, which I'll try to put in lay terms. And then third, I'm going to describe some of the proposals that have been made, including by the President and his review group, to reform these NSA programs or change them and reform the FISA authorities, and just share a couple thoughts about that. I have a feeling Judge Carr may speak a little bit more about that as well. So what is it that the NSA is doing that's so controversial that is the subject of the Snowden leaks? There are two primary programs that, as I say, at least have the potential to touch on the privacy interests of Americans. One is actually targeted at international communications involving a non-U.S. person, which means not a U.S. citizen and not a permanent resident alien of the U.S., who is reasonably believed to be outside the United States. So it's actually targeted at non-U.S. persons or foreign persons who are not here but outside the U.S. But it's collected in the U.S. on networks in the U.S. So by definition, it must be involving some international communications of those persons that are coming into or going out of the U.S., coming to or from that foreign person, and therefore it may involve a U.S. person here in the United States on the domestic end. So it may involve communications of U.S. persons. This program is actually collecting the content of those communications. So it does involve the reasonable expectation of privacy that the participants in those communications have. It is something that would constitute a search under Supreme Court case law for purposes of the Fourth Amendment. But it involves international communications and is being done for the purpose of foreign intelligence collection. The second program is what General Alexander spent a good amount of time on. That's the telephone metadata program. It does not involve any content, as he said. It just involves tables of numbers, simple numbers, what phone number called what number, at what time, and for what duration. Metadata, that is data about communications, not the content of the communications themselves. And that is the telephone metadata that the NSA has been collecting, as they say, in bulk. That's all of the metadata about those communications, both domestic and international. So it definitely includes domestic to domestic calling records in the US. Now, interestingly, it's that second program that's gotten so much attention and controversy in Washington, but it's the first program that's gotten so much attention and controversy overseas among European allies, but also in Silicon Valley with our internet and high-tech companies, because 80% of their user base is people outside the United States. So it's definitely focused on their services and the communications that are very important to some of their users. So let me describe a little bit more about the genesis of the programs and also the legal basis, because I think they interrelate with each other. This program of collecting the international communications of foreign persons, this is the successor to President Bush's warrantless surveillance program that was disclosed by the New York Times in 1995, where following 9/11, President Bush gave special presidential authority to enable the NSA, or authorize the NSA, to collect the content of international communications for some number of targets presumed to be suspects, terrorist suspects, almost all located outside the United States, collecting their communications in and out of the U.S. Caused quite a controversy that it was being done without a, quote, warrant. Historically, very interesting, and this relates to the Fourth Amendment analysis of this program, the courts, Supreme Court has never reached this issue, but the courts of appeals that have been consistent in it, in concluding that when it comes to foreign intelligence collection, even of the content of communications, focused on a foreign threat to the United States, done under the authority of the president, that does not require a warrant approved by a court. It is a search for Fourth Amendment purposes, but the question is it reasonable? That's the standard under the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protects our private communications from unreasonable searches, and then requires that when warrants are issued, they must be supported by probable cause, and they must be individualized and particularized in their description of what's being searched. But the courts have said, and the executive branch has exercised its authority on this basis, that a court-approved warrant is not required for foreign intelligence collection. Prior to 1978, in the enactment of the FISA statute, this kind of collection was done without court approval, without warrants, under the direction of the President and the Attorney General. And that was the consistent practice. Now, it did result in abuses, as Professor Chesney mentioned, from the 1974 congressional reports. There were abuses, unlike, as the President has said, the NSA programs today. And the authorities were abused to focus on domestic dissenters, et cetera. And as a result of that, and the controversies that created, Congress passed the FISA statute. And FISA did involve, for the first time, Article III judges, another branch of government, having to come in and approve foreign intelligence surveillance orders to collect the content of communications where the participants in the communications have a reasonable expectation of privacy, to listen into calls, to read emails, et cetera. Though in 1978, there weren't any emails. But importantly, the international aspect and the foreign-focused part was intentionally carved out by Congress in 1978. And the intent was, and it's very clear in the record, to let NSA continue to collect outside the United States and international communications in and out of the United States with no warrant and no FISA court approval. The problem is between 1978 and 2001, when 9/11 hit, the technology changed. There was a sea change in technology. In 1978, almost all international communications were carried by satellite, and they were carefully carved out of the definition of what communications required that court approval. By 2001, they were almost all carried on a wire in and out of the U.S., a cable. And suddenly, what previously had been exempt from FISA required court approval every single time you wanted to collect that communication, if you were doing it on a wire in the United States, which is the best place for us to do it. It gives us the richest understanding of the communication. So suddenly, when 9/11 hit, by that time, every single one of these communications required an individualized order. And that had been tolerable for the executive branch up to 9/11, but when 9/11 hit and we expected another attack any day, it was not tolerable. We had 11,000, 15,000, whatever it were, suspects, terrorist suspects outside the U.S. We needed to do immediate communication collection on any communication they might have in or out of the U.S., because that was the most important information to know. So that's why the President did the warrantless surveillance program. Created quite a controversy when the New York Times disclosed it, huge debates, but nobody was impeached. Nobody went to jail. What happened? At the end of those debates, and there were a ton of debates in Congress, et cetera, in 2008, Congress actually amended the FISA statute to facilitate exactly this kind of collection on international communications. That's the FISA Amendments Act of 1978. General Alexander mentioned it, and there's a provision in there, Section 702, and that's a big chunk. That's the PRISM collection you've heard about. It's the big chunk of the content-related collection that has been disclosed by the Snowden disclosures. This is a special authority Congress approved that allows a broad program of collection on these international communications of foreign targets. And it allows the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence to develop procedures to ensure that this collection will be entirely focused on a foreign target and will not intentionally collect the communications of the U.S. person, whether directly or indirectly. There's all kinds of restrictions. He has to put in place these procedures, and if he's got them in there, then the FISA court gets to review them and approve them. Every year, the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence can issue orders, basically at their own pen, with their own pen, to communications providers like internet providers to give the government access. Again, access to communications collection that's targeted on a foreign end of communication. But it can include emails, web visits, telephone calls, etc., to people in the U.S., in and out. And then the other requirement is if there's a U.S. person's information that's collected, it's carefully minimized and restricted in terms of how you can share that, and you have to mask the person's name and any information about them unless it's absolutely necessary to understand the intelligence value of that collection when you report it to another intelligence agency. So that's the 702 foreign targeted collection. Again, the constitutional basis is what I said, that it's long been recognized that for that kind of foreign targeted international communication, a warrant is not required for foreign intelligence collection. That's going to be tested because this is the case that went up to the Supreme Court, the Clapper case, and the Amnesty International brought it. Supreme Court said there was not standing to challenge it in that case. But there will be standing one of these days soon in one of these criminal cases where evidence from this collection is being used and the government has informed the defendant it's being challenged. It will make its way to the Supreme Court. And so that proposition about whether a warrant is required and whether it has to be done individualized will be tested in the court. This is the program that's caused a lot of consternation in Europe and with the internet companies, but I'm telling you, I just flew in from Washington today. It's not controversial in Washington. 95+% of the controversy in Washington, the political heat and debate, is on the other program, the telephone metadata program. That program does not involve any content. As the general was at pains to describe, it's metadata. It's transactional records about communications, the telltale record that there was a communication. These are business records, in this case, that are generated by the telephone companies for their own business purposes to do billing of customers, etc. They keep them for a few months, just as long as they need them. What the NSA does is it gets a court order from the FISA court permitting the NSA to collect these records from the phone companies in order to, A, preserve them, because the phone companies don't keep them for very long, 18 months at the most. And the NSA wants to do historical analysis, not just who's talking to who today, what numbers are calling what numbers today, but 3 years ago. That's very valuable information for putting together a counterterrorism investigation. So the NSA, A, wants to preserve the data from the different companies, and B, it wants to be able to aggregate it together in a common format that's easily searchable. That's not something any one company can do. So the big thing here is NSA is trying to create a database which doesn't actually exist in the servers of any one company, preserve it for a period of time to be able to do historical analysis. And it doesn't absolutely have to have 100% of the records of these telephone calls, these phone numbers, what number's calling what number, but it wants the most it can get, as the general said, because the more comprehensive the data set, the more you can be sure you're catching the connections. And this was a capability that didn't exist before 9/11. And I think as the president said pretty eloquently in his speech on January 17th, and it's been said by General Alexander and others, and in fact, Mike Morrell, who's the former deputy director of the CIA, who was on the president's review group, testified to this at Congress. If we had had this database capability, this metadata program before 9/11, it may well have prevented 9/11 because we would have been able to see that that safe house in Yemen was communicated with Al-Midar in San Diego. We didn't know he was in San Diego. He was one of the 15 hijackers. So the constitutional analysis of this metadata program is very different from the 702 because it doesn't involve any content. The Supreme Court has said this kind of transactional record, this kind of metadata, is not information that the people making the phone calls have a reasonable expectation of privacy in. It doesn't involve a reasonable expectation of privacy because it doesn't involve the private content of anybody's communication, and because the records really aren't our records. These are records that are generated by the phone company for billing purposes. And if you think about it, every day there are multiple federal agencies and state agencies, law enforcement, but just regulatory agencies as well, that do investigations for their own programs, their own purposes. And they have broad authority to get these kinds of records when they're conducting investigations. Lots of agencies across the government have authority, it's called administrative subpoena power, to ask for records like this where it's relevant to an authorized investigation. The NSA operates under a similar model, but with much more rigorous requirements. The NSA operates under what General Alexander referred to as 215. That's actually Section 215 of the Patriot Act. It's an amendment to the FISA statute. So again, this is a FISA authority that requires approval of the FISA court. And it allows the NSA to get a business records order that says it can get business records from companies that are relevant to an authorized counterterrorism investigation. That's the authority it uses to get these telephone records. And the argument for why all the records are relevant to the investigation is that the NSA needs the entire database to be able to preserve it in order to do the kind of analysis that only this database enables it to do, this contact chaining analysis of connections to connect the dots. It's not doing what has been referred to as data mining or trolling through this database looking for patterns randomly. It can only access it under this court order when it has reasonable suspicion that a particular number is associated with a foreign terrorist organization, and then it queries the database to find the connections. So it's looking for new numbers we didn't know about before, and then it tips them out to the FBI to follow up as part of a counterterrorism investigation. So let me just talk 2 minutes about the reforms that have been proposed to these. All the reforms are really, that I'm going to mention, focus on the telephone metadata program, because again, that's the program that's caused all the controversy. There's an argument or assumption that it really does infringe on people's privacy interests. That's basically a disagreement with the current state of Supreme Court case law under the Fourth Amendment. If the Supreme Court changes its view and says these kinds of records are private records that people have reasonable expectation of privacy in, then this kind of program cannot be conducted. You cannot get this kind of data in bulk. But I think I don't foresee that happening because that would cripple the regulatory investigations of countless agencies that depend on this kind of analysis to get broad databases where they may need to preserve the database to do subsequent queries because certain records within it may be germane to an investigation. That's pretty common. That's the way investigations happen. I think that's what this authority was designed to provide for. So there are proposals that would limit the NSA just to specific one-by-one records that are relevant and pertain to a particular individual for an investigation. They couldn't collect it in bulk. Again, that would end the program as it's designed. There were also suggestions that the NSA could only query the data while the telephone companies hold it in the ordinary course of business. That would prevent them from being able to combine it together and see all the connections. It would also lose the historical value because the data would be lost when the companies purge it or write over it. A couple of other proposals have been made, including by the president. One is, well, why does the NSA have to keep the data? There's a talk about moving it to the telephone companies or moving it to a third-party contractor. I think no one telephone company has the capacity to manage all this data, certainly not to hold it historically. So that option would necessarily require a private contractor. The data would probably be moved from the basement of Fort Meade, where it's on very secure servers that I think are actually protected from incursion from outside, probably to much less secure servers in some suburban office park somewhere where a bunch of contractor employees like Edward Snowden would have the access to the database. It would also be potentially subject to subpoena and civil litigations. I think it would be much less safe, much more subject to potential incursion, also less efficient for the NSA. The president has said he wants to do this, but he's asked the Attorney General to study if it can be possibly done. He's recognized there are lots of problems with it. I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of that process it's decided not to do that. The president has also directed that before they query the database, the court has to approve the numbers that they query. That has the real potential to slow down the process, make it much more bureaucratic and lawyerly. There's a big question about whether that's going to be done in batches of numbers or one by one. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being batches of numbers, something that's more tolerable in terms of the flexibility of the program. I'm going to stop there. I've gone on way too long, but happy to answer questions about the specifics of the program and the legal issues that they raise.
Judge Carr, can you hear us okay? Judge Carr, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, oh, sure, fine.
Great.
Okay. I'd like to start by saying a couple things. First, I apologize for not being there. I'd made a prior commitment to participate in a program here in Toledo that lasted until an hour ago, and I simply, obviously, couldn't get there physically once that program is over. I don't know if any of you are former law students in the audience, but if you are, I want to tell you how welcome you make me feel by sitting as far away from me as you can, both figuratively and literally. Make me feel quite welcome back in a law school class. Mr. Bradbury gave sort of a bird's eye view or a macro view of much of what is involved in the current controversies and concerns and public discussion. I thought I will try to stay within my 10 allotted minutes. Just very briefly, what does the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court do? It reviews applications from federal agencies involved in intelligence gathering, foreign intelligence gathering. Not domestic, it's not focused, that's the FBI, so forth. But agencies like the FBI, Department of Defense, CIA, so forth, State Department, can come to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and submit an application, and all that they have to show is probable cause to believe that the communications are to be intercepted. They can be telephone communications, electronic communications, spoken communications like this, fax communications, whatever it may be, that interception is likely to intercept communications by a U.S. person that's either a citizen or a lawful resident alien. If the communication is not likely to involve a U.S. person or anything a U.S. person is communicating, FISA and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court don't play a role. You have to show probable cause that such a person is either acting on behalf of or is affiliated with a foreign government, or the communications of such persons will involve contact and communications with U.S. persons. For example, the third commercial attaché for the Kingdom of Xanadu in the consulate here in Toledo, Ohio. And that person, though a foreign citizen and not clothed necessarily the protection of the Fourth Amendment, Americans are going to be talking to him or her. And therefore, if they want to intercept listen to his phone conversations, intercept his email traffic or whatever, they have to get a foreign intelligence surveillance order. But it's a very easy standard to meet, that the fact that he is affiliated with the Kingdom of Xanadu, a foreign government, that's all they need to show. The other portion is, of course, counterterrorism. And once again, if the government comes to Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and shows that the communications of a U.S. person are likely to be intercepted either because the target is a U.S. person or the target's foreign-born, it doesn't really matter in that regard. It's that to some extent communications of U.S. persons will be intercepted through this proposed surveillance. All the government has to show is probable cause to believe that that person, the target, whose computer is going to be surveyed, phones, whatever, is affiliated with or acting on behalf of a foreign-based terrorist organization. But in either instance, it has to be foreign-based. Almost all of these applications are fact-based, and the government makes those showings. It is a relatively easy showing to make. The applications are very lengthy, can run 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 pages. They're very detailed. Occasionally they read like a Tom Clancy novel, but by and large they're pretty humdrum, pretty routine, involve people who may want to do bad things to our country, but nonetheless the evidence is there. It's a lesser standard than for an ordinary search warrant, an ordinary wiretap. They don't have to show a crime is being committed, about to be committed, or has been committed. So it's a low standard. Once in a while, the government, as it did with the PRISM program back in 2008, proposes a new technique, a new approach, a new something or other, usually because of a technological advance or a new application of technology to the acquisition of foreign intelligence. And it is in those kinds of situations, which really are quite infrequent on the whole. They arose occasionally when I was a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court judge, and that actually is what prompted me to come up with the proposal that I'm about to describe now, and that is when the government is proposing something of that sort, something that's new, something that's novel, a technique, an approach, some circumstance that is out of the ordinary, at least in terms of past practice. It's my recommendation that the government, or at that point, the court should be permitted, or actually I've refined my view to think it should be required, to call upon one of a cadre, a small select cadre of attorneys, probably in the D.C. area, who've been previously cleared for all the wall-to-wall surveillance background check. And that the court, that individual can come in and basically challenge or decide not to challenge the government's request on either statutory grounds or constitutional grounds. Not on the grounds of discretion or judgment. Is this a worthwhile thing to do? Because the statute's quite clear. That's not a decision that the court makes. If the probable cause is there, if the surveillance it wants to conduct is in fact lawful under the Constitution and statute, we must issue those orders. But in any event, to introduce at the outset, in a limited number of cases, very infrequently, but very importantly, an adversary system, the give and take. The government wants to do this. Somebody from outside is basically being heard as to whether or not that can be done under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the Constitution. And my proposal is a very modest proposal. It's as simple as that. It would not require a vast bureaucracy. I know that among the proposals that have been considered in Congress, as to which there have been hearings and so forth, is to create an office of special advocate. In other words, to have an outside agency to which all FISA applications are submitted, then the function of that agency is to review them and to make a decision whether it should appear before the court and argue against the application. I don't think that's necessary. The simple reason that the occasions when that would make any difference whatsoever are so few and so far in between. The current Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court rules, there are rules of procedure. They are published. They are available. Rule 11, which was adopted in 2008 or 2007, I can't remember which, I actually wrote the original set of rules, including this one. Rule 11 requires the government that when it wants to do something new and novel, something it hasn't done before, it must inform the court. It must notify the court that this is something new. It codified the practices that then existed. It existed for years. Because the government, contrary to the public perception, the Justice Department lawyers who are appearing before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court are indeed honest brokers. They know that if they don't do that, and the judge doesn't realize that is what is being sought, and something like the current controversy comes back to haunt the judge and the court, then a crack will have been, there will have been a breach in the relationship between the department and the court. Just as in any other judicial proceeding, the lawyers have to be straightforward. They have to deal honestly with the judges before whom they are appearing. And that rule simply requires the government notify when it wants to do something new or novel. And in my view, that should be a trigger for the court then to call upon independent counsel. There may be nothing that is objectionable to it under the statute or the Constitution, but at least from a judge's perspective, there would be a purely independent set of eyes looking at it. Another reason, in my view, that we do not need to create an entire outside cadre, a bureaucracy, an agency, whatever you want to call it, of lawyers who review each and every application of the several thousands that come before the court each year, is that within the court itself, and this is a situation I think most people are unaware of, the court has a cadre of legal advisors. When I was on the court, there was one when I joined in 2002, and I think 4 or 5 when I left in 2008. These are very experienced lawyers, highly skilled, very competent. They're not magistrates, but they're not law clerks. They serve, as the title indicates, as legal advisors. They quite simply know more about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, more about decisions made by other judges in the court, more of the history of and the course and sequence of the kinds of decisions that have been made in the past than any judge does. And again, by rule, the department has to submit a copy of a proposed application to the court 7 days, at least 7 days, before it is going to be presented formally for judicial consideration. And that rule serves 2 functions. Once again, it was a codification of practice. That's the way things had always worked. The legal advisors review each and every one of those proposed applications. And this is something that I think is very important for the public to be aware of. The legal advisors push back. And indeed, within the department itself and within the agencies. And Mr. Bradbury, I have no doubt, could go into this in greater detail because he was one of the people doing the pushing back. These things don't sort of flow automatically from some counterterrorism agent in Los Angeles and the FBI who thinks it's a nifty idea to put a tap on somebody's phone, and all of a sudden it's presented to a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court judge. It's reviewed within the agency, reviewed thoroughly within the department, and then, even though it survived those reviews, it's reviewed by our legal advisors. And not infrequently, I would show up on a Tuesday morning and I would be given a docket of maybe, 40 to 60 applications that were being presented for my consideration that week. And almost invariably, there'd be some small number of those, I'd be told, it's been withdrawn. It's not being presented. In some, I believe many of those instances, it's been withdrawn probably permanently because of the response given to the application by the legal advisor to the Justice Department attorney and to the agency itself. That event is nowhere recorded or registered or made public. I think it should be, because it reflects in reality the court doing the job, institutionally doing the job that people are concerned that it may not be doing. In other words, the idea that somehow it's a rubber stamp. And so it seems to me that sort of when the decision not to go forward in an application reflects a government's reaction to a legal advisor's discussion and objections and concerns, that is in effect a turn down. That application will never be presented. That surveillance will never occur. And so it seems to me that to create a special advocate, as I understand the proposal, an independent agency, freestanding, that reviews and vets all proposed FISA applications, I really don't believe it is all necessary. And I think that would, in fact, create the kind of disruption and significant potential for delay, particularly in the routine run-of-the-mill cases, that is not necessary. The kinds of cases I'm talking about arise infrequently, a few times a year. They almost always do not involve some sort of emergency situation. The court and the process could take that kind of time. If you had an independent attorney, like under the Criminal Justice Act, there are attorneys upon whom a court can call and appoint. That attorney could appear not only before the court, would be knowledgeable, also, and I think importantly, would add a dimension that does not exist today, and that is where the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act judge approved this new and novel activity, that lawyer could then file a notice of appeal to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court of Review. To date, that court has heard, 6, 8, 4 or 5 cases, one brought by the government, to my knowledge, maybe 2, and 2 or 3 brought by providers, the internet service providers or telephone companies who were unhappy with the court's approval. But they hadn't been before the court at the time, but because they were directed by the order to participate in it, they had standing to seek appellate review. The target does not today. The target should not in most cases. But if we had the kind of structure that I'm proposing, that would provide the opportunity for appellate review and ultimately for Supreme Court review. Because today, if the government gets its way, because the FISA court has approved the application and order, it's not going to approve, it's not going to appeal, because it's won. And so that basically is the gist of what I'm suggesting and hoping somebody is listening and following up on. It's a modest proposal. I think it accommodates a need that exists because we're ordinary district judges. We sit roughly once every 11 weeks. When something of this sort comes in, it truly is new and novel. We can't go to a treatise or a case book or law school notes or whatever and find some precedent, some easy answer. And part of it, and this is my concluding comments, as Mr. Bradbury alluded to, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the court lie in what I like to describe as a constitutional shadowland. We don't know the extent to which the Fourth Amendment in any way whatsoever impairs or impedes the president's authority under Article 2, which is exclusive, to protect our country against foreign dangers, wherever those foreign dangers may exist, whether within this country or coming from without or both. The President's authority to protect us from foreign-based terrorism and threats from foreign governments is absolute under Article 2. The word judge or justice appears nowhere in that article. We don't know how far the Fourth Amendment goes in curbing his authority. On the other hand, we don't know how far his authority goes without regard to the Fourth Amendment. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is a tripartite compromise between all three branches of government. Congress has endowed the Article 3 judiciary in this court with this function to make some very modest judgments in very specific circumstances as to whether the government can do what it thinks it should be able to do. And it therefore represents some slight judicial oversight and control in the interest of protecting the communications privacy of all of us. And so, in speaking very candidly, I don't want any court, not just because of the composition of this Supreme Court, but any Supreme Court, drawing those lines. I think those lines should be left undefined and unclear. And I really feel that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the court has served the Republic and the Constitution and the constitutional rights of all of us very well. And I think that if we had, as a judge, the opportunity from time to time to bring somebody in to give us a different view, that would be of great assistance. And I think, I would hope, would enhance the public confidence in the work that the court does. And I'm more than glad to take questions at the appropriate time, and if I've run over too long, I apologize. Thank you for your attention.
General Trainer.
Well, I suppose you all find it a little strange that a guy that spent his entire career as a professional Marine is called upon to talk about the press in this particular issue. But I do bring a certain flavor, I think, and a certain attitude that perhaps a regular journalist would not. When I retired from the Marine Corps in 1985, I went with the New York Times, and I was in the journalism business, either the print journal or television, until 2010. And while I was not, I suppose, born and bred as a journalist, I could be classifying myself as an observant and concerned witness to the press. When we talk about the media in dealing with this sensitive issue that's the subject of these panels, you better understand the creature, the animal that we're talking about. And from my position, I'll give you the interpretation both individually and also collectively, institutionally. Journalists today are well educated, usually from Ivy, with the big papers, usually from Ivy League schools. They're no longer the 1935 movie characterization of a journalist with the hat, the cigar, and the whiskey bottle in the desk and the New York accent. No, these guys are highly educated. They're very idealistic. Generally speaking, they are liberal. They are liberal. They are skeptical of authority. They are skeptical of just about everything. And they are very intrusive because they want to find out why they are being skeptical. So that, I think, is kind of a fingernail sketch of the average journalist today, whether he's in print journalism or whether he's in the television medium. Now, how about the institution? Well, the institution is made up of journalists like this who have moved on. And maybe some of that skepticism has turned to cynicism. But the fact is, they also are, like the journalists, intent. They're very patriotic, very nationalistic, and they are very interested in making sure that the public is served. Now, there is a difference between, in my view, between print journalism and the media, the television journalism. television journalism is shallow. Now, I don't mean that as an indictment. I simply consider that an observation. It goes 24/7. It's a medium of images. Rarely do thinking people, or people in general, consider so much what a talking head says. They are more impressed by the way he looks, the way he expresses himself. In print journalism, you may know the guy's byline, but you have no idea what he looks like or how well he expresses himself. He's got it written down there on a piece of paper, and that usually has a longer impact on the recipient than the television journalist. The other feature is that exists in both mediums is competition, severe competition. Individually, journalists are looking for the scoop that's going to give them a Pulitzer Prize, and will go to almost any lengths to get that. In the infrastructure, the adult supervision in terms of the senior journalists who are now on the editorial side of the house, theirs is still competition also. There's no question about that. But it's competition not with regard to other journalists, but it's with regard to the opposite, the competition. The New York Times against the Washington Post is the one that I'm most familiar with. And they watch each other, and if the Washington Post gets a story that the New York Times misses, rest assured the New York Times the next day will have a matching story to pick it up. Now, but there is a time difference space there in the print journalism. Televisions, that's not the same. I have observed within the television that they're not so much interested in what the news is it's that they have something graphically and something exciting and something new to show that the other networks do not have. And that is particularly true with the networks. Now, there is some good, thoughtful, and deep television, but it's usually on public broadcasting or C-SPAN or something like that. But the best competition or comparison to print journalism is the broadcast news, not the C-SPAN sort of thing is more akin to magazine journalism. But newspaper journalism is the closest to that, and the television side of is on broadcast. Okay, now, with that as background, what is the motivation of the journalist, whether it's print or television? I would say that the fundamental North Star of the institutional journalism is concupiscence. Notre Dame graduates should understand concupiscence. It's the tendency to lie, cheat, and steal for your own best interest that you have to resist because nature pushes you in that direction. And they believe that all journalists all believe that institutions, whether they are private institutions, governmental institutions, religious institutions, all suffer and can give in to concupiscence, that they are all lie, cheat, and steal. And as the fourth estate, the guardian of democracy, it is the job of the journalist to get at the truth and expose the truth. Too often they're correct in that. I mean, they're correct. The cover-up of the Catholic Church and the sexual abuse of the children, the IRS scandal most recently, the cover-up of Abu Ghraib and all those terrible things. So you can understand why journalists sometimes feel that they're the only ones that are honest in town, and institutional America is corruptible and corrupt. Now, how do you deal with something like that? If you are asking me what the role of journalism should be, you're asking me how to herd cats, and you can't herd cats because they're all individualists. They will go in 6 or 7 different directions. I'm not telling you what their role should be. I'm telling you what to expect their role will be, and that will be they will be independent, and they will be mavericks, and they will penetrate, and there will be the sense that the presumption is all news is newsworthy. That is the presumption, and they will print everything and anything that they come across. But, like all presumptions, there are factors that will overcome the presumption so that it no longer is valid in a particular incident. But that's not the job of the journalist. That is the job of the institution or the aspect of the institution who has this sensitive piece of information that they don't believe should be in the public domain. It's their responsibility to be able to make the case to a journalism to overcome the presumption. And a classic case of that was the case of the reports of the Vietnamese War, the Pentagon Papers. The government tried very desperately to cause the New York Times to back off. The argument of the government overwhelmed the presumption of the press. They failed to do it, and we had the Pentagon Papers come out and didn't do any serious damage. So the burden of proof on conducting whether it's cyberspace or any of the somewhat sensitive subjects in the part of the government, the burden to protect is not by asking the press because we want to protect future operations or personnel. No, you've got to be able in the government or any other institution dealing with the press, you've got to be able to make your case. And if a case that will overcome the presumption that the press works on, that all news is legal news. And if you can't do that, then you're going to expect the consequences to your own embarrassment. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be aggressive, but it means that you have to make a strong, tough, legalistic case, a moral, ethical, and practical case to hard-bitten journalists who are out looking for the scoop. And if you do that, I think you're going to find that the fourth estate in this country will be responsible, with perhaps rare exceptions, so that I don't think we should have a fear for the Republic that we're going down in flames because the press is violating secrets. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So I think we'll take a couple questions here.
This is for Judge Carr. When you're talking about legal advisors, it made their role sound like your role, like the role of the court itself. If they're doing the investigations on all the requests that are coming in, making those assertions, it strikes me that that FISA is getting basically a predetermined outcome. And from what I've read, or I think I've read over the last period of time, is that the number of requests that have been denied, having reached the court, is quite small. I'm wondering if maybe the court shouldn't be involved pretty much exclusively based upon your convincing arguments of efficiency. If it shouldn't only be involved with the change issues that you described would be contested before the court. Thank you.
Judge, hang on, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry. If I understand the question, I believe it is, well, if we have these legal advisors and if so many applications, which they are pretty routine and straightforward, then shouldn't we perhaps reserve the exercise of the Article III judge authority for things like the prison program or other new and novel applications? Is that your question? Basically, yeah. Okay. Well, the problem with that is that the statute itself requires judicial approval, and these are search warrants. And it would be contrary to the Constitution to require that no warrant shall issue but on probable cause by a judge. I mean, the Supreme Court has held that a neutral and detached magistrate, and in this case, I think that you would have to have at least a magistrate judge, and Congress has decided that an Article III judge would fill this role. Because once again, we're talking about intrusion into communications privacy. That is clearly protected by the Fourth Amendment. And Congress has decided in this circumstance, because of the Fourth Amendment concerns, even though we don't know if the Fourth Amendment plays a role vis-a-vis the President's conduct of our foreign affairs and our defense, nonetheless, that these are warrants, and warrants require issuance by a judge. And so I think that would not be legal. And once again, I mean, these people are advisors. We make the final decision. But they do help us and advise us. It is, I think that the title fits the activity, that they're legal advisors. But they don't make the final decision. There are times when I would disagree with them. I would take a different slant. But so I think the answer to your question is no, that's not permissible. To touch upon another thing, yes, the number of instances in which a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court judge has turned down an application is very slight. So, in fact, I think even to a lesser extent is a number of occasions in which an Article III judge like myself has turned down a law enforcement application for a Title III electronic surveillance order. And the reason for that, and the standard for getting that's much higher. That's a criminal investigation, clearly controlled by the Constitution and so forth, and by statute. The reason for that is, by the time these applications come to us, the factual basis is there. Keep in mind, especially in the FISA context, it's a very low standard. Probable cause to believe that you are affiliated with a foreign government, or acting on behalf of a foreign government, or that you're affiliated with a foreign-based terrorist organization, or acting on its behalf. And that can be established through a variety of means. Physical surveillance, pen register surveillance, like the metadata orders issued by the court, and there's a whole host of means. Acquisition of business records, and that sort of thing. So I think that there is a fair and good reason for the very low frequency with which applications are turned down. The same is true with ordinary search warrants. They're never turned down. Ordinary law enforcement Title III applications, they're never turned down. And it's because the government is doing its job. So in the arena of search warrants and law enforcement wiretaps, at some point it's easier to determine whether that's so, because that stuff shows up as evidence in court, it's tested by way of motion to suppress, and there's a public airing and determination of its legitimacy. But in every instance, to my knowledge, where FISA take, as a result of a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court order, has wound up as evidence in court, the lower federal courts, district and appellate courts have held that its acquisition conformed to the statute and the Constitution. So,
my name is Richard Friedman. I'm associated with the American Bar Association Committee on Law and National Security. Two comments. One is media. Judge, you're telegenic, and I suggest that you consider going on national television as a judicial commentator. You'd be great. And the second one, we have in the audience a representative of the McCormick Foundation.
I've just had cataract surgery, and you may want to try it yourself. Other than that, thank you for the comment. Go ahead. Your question is?
Well, it's not. It's a comment. The other encomium is we have a representative of the McCormick Foundation, which for the past 25 years has been educating media people on national security matters. 2 generations of reporters, and we're most grateful to them. My challenge can best be expressed in a bet, 2-horse bet. Who would you bet on? One, let's keep America safe and secure. That's 1 horse. And the components are policy people, policy wonks who succeed in getting it wrong, real wrong, about half the time. We've already had a confession from the intelligence community that they get it wrong about half the time. We've heard a lot of stuff about Section 215, 720, the Patriot Act. Wonderful, but there are constraints, in my view, about getting to the essence of what the real problem is. And let's get on to the second horse. And the second horse is called destruction to the infidels. And who are they? They're a handful of very wily people who are operating in secret in odd places. They don't need a lot of money to do what it is that they want to do. So I guess my question, which is probably obvious from the way that I've framed it, is that the bad guys are at an advantage over the good guys. And we've spent about 5 hours here today talking about issues on how to cure that problem. What we have not talked about are the trends. Big data, we've touched on that. Drones, if you have $400, you can go to Radio Shack and equip a drone with to make it a lot of damage. So these are the kinds of things that we ought to be addressing. The micro focus is terrific, but I think that there's a need to enlarge the discussion to get back to the essentials. My apologies for not framing this with a question mark, but at least I thought that I would add to the mix a comment and an observation.
Well, if I can simply follow up and say, a problem since the enactment of Title III, the law enforcement statute in 1968, technology has constantly outrun the law. And I mean, that's part of the problem as well. And it's trying to confine the potential that technology has for adverse effect upon our daily lives and particularly our privacy. That's the law's main business in this area. So.
I think we have time for one more question.
General, this one is probably more for you, but with the rise of social media and I guess the tendency of social media to be more about images and emotion and quick punchlines, I guess how concerned should we be about a less informed public and how a less informed public, how their demands would impact our intelligence community's ability to counteract foreign threats?
I think that has to be put in the larger context of what's happening here, this social media revolution. It would fit into Clausewitz's concept of the rules of war. Think of it. Think of what's just happened in here within the last couple of years, of this, what the social media has done. Look at what happened in Cairo. Look at what happened in Libya. Look at what happened in Tunis. That's the social media. Then that is really, in a sense, replacing in large measure for the conventional media, because people get on the social media and in an instant, whether what they say is true, half true, not true, deliberate, accidental, it goes out in a second, and that becomes the movement. That takes on a life of its own. Regardless of what's going on with conventional outlets of news, conventional approaches and pronouncements by the government, the social media is the revolution of the 21st century, the way the American Revolution and the French Revolution were in the 1700s. It's just that it makes revolution, and it is making revolution, and we don't know how to handle it. But we better learn how to corral it, because we're going to be victims of it if we don't. So in that sense, you bring up the idea of the social media. Social media is powerful.
Thank you to our panelists, some extraordinary insights here, and we thank you for your
May
efforts.
I make one final request? And I mean, Mr. Friedman, is that correct?
That's it.
Okay. About 20 years ago, the ABA conducted a study and issued standards on law enforcement and technology. That was preceded in 1968 or 70 by criminal justice standards on electronic surveillance. And I would suggest to you that the ABA might have an opportunity to be heard on all these subjects that have expanded to such an extent in the intervening 20 years. So just a thought and a comment for you, sir, and I apologize for interrupting the moderator, but thank you.
May I respond just real quick? Get out of your hair in a minute. Judge, we just finished a 2-year study, cybersecurity, and we're online, and you might take a look at it. The ABA Committee on Law and National Security, there's 2 publications. It's on our website. One's a long one that's not discernible other than to techies, but there's a smaller one for $20, the playbook on cybersecurity. And I think it fits your question like a glove, and I would commend it to others who might be interested in cybersecurity. Thanks for bringing that up, but I think that this might be of interest to you and your colleagues.
It is. Thank you.
Thanks again to everyone, to our panelists especially, and thanks to Mike Desch for putting this great program together.